Paris, summer 1940. France has been defeated by the German Wehrmacht.
Mortal terror. There is nothing worse than fearing for your very life.
The SS and the French police begin their hunt for Jews.
You felt you were in danger, and this fear never ever left you.
But there are places of refuge and people who know what is right and what is wrong.
Evil doesn't always have to triumph. There is also goodness in people. I will never forget how 5 French people risked their lives for a young boy who wet the bed every single night. I owe my life to those 5 people, and I will never forget it.
Hamburg, 1938. As in the rest of Germany for the last 5 years, the National Socialists have been in power. Citizens of Jewish origin have been harangued, dispossessed, and forced out of their jobs. The parents of Georges Arthur Goldschmidt decide to send their son abroad. They themselves are no longer permitted to leave Germany. For the boy, it will be the journey of his life.
I lived in Rheinbeek near Hamburg, which was 27 minutes away by suburban train. I can remember the route exactly, station for station, scene for scene. The train left from the last platform on the north side of Hamburg station. It's still there today. I can still remember my parents gradually disappearing from view. My father had taken off his hat so we could still recognize him. We had this final sight of him standing there next to his wife. I was certain that I would never see my parents again. Children know everything. That feeling will never leave me.
His great journey took Georges Arthur through Italy and into the mountains of the French Alps.
Another thing I still remember perfectly is this big tunnel you go through before reaching Bardonecchia and Moudon. It's about 10 kilometers long. As we emerged from it, I saw this dry grass, like hair, hanging down the cliff. I knew it was the first grass of freedom. And I had come from what I'd call terrorized Germany. We children felt that. Germany was a country where you always turned your head to see if someone was following you. Even the landscape was scared. And that was where life began for me. I knew that I was free. I knew that France would protect me. And that was an incredible feeling.
France, the preferred refuge of German and Austrian Jews trying to escape from National Socialist persecution. There was anti-Semitism here too, but in the eyes of the law, all citizens were equal. In 1933, Alfred Grosser arrived here with his family. The National Socialists had destroyed the father's livelihood.
First, they took away my father's pediatric clinic. He was no longer allowed to be its director. Then I learned from my mother that he had also been expelled from the Association of Wearers of the Iron Cross, first class.
Paul Grosser, a German patriot and a highly decorated officer of the Imperial Army.
He spent 4 years at the front. He was a doctor for 4 years. And then he said, I am no longer treated as a German. We are leaving. That was an early decision and a sound one.
It was indeed a momentous decision for the entire Grosser family. But the father could not cope with being debased and ostracized.
3 weeks after we arrived in France, he died of a heart attack. He was a man of culture who had been expelled from his culture.
Loss and a new beginning. Initially, Georges Arthur Goldschmidt's great journey ended here at the foot of Mont Blanc. In Megève, a fashionable winter sports resort. The Collège Florine Montagne boarding school became something of a new home for the boy from Rheinbeck near Hamburg, who at the time was still called Jürgen Arthur.
I arrived without ever having heard a single word of French. In November of that year, I was with my friends when the first snowflakes began to fall. One of them turned and said, "Oh, les premiers flocons!" Oh, the first snowflakes. And I suddenly realized that I had spoken French for months without being aware of it. Because children understand in a way that is totally different from how adults think they understand. After that, I started speaking French as if I had been born to it.
French, the door to a new life. Life as a Frenchman.
They put me in a really low class to learn French. Nearly all the teachers were women, and they were very kind to me. I learned French very quickly, and things moved fast. After a year in the 8th class, I jumped a year, and in the 6th class, I was back in my own age group, and I came first in French.
This bright pupil from Frankfurt quickly made friends, and a name for himself in a small way with the Scouts of Saint-Germain.
I was in charge of a small group of 6 scouts. We won a competition, and the group leader, that was me, was allowed to carry the flag. It wasn't actually a flag, just this funny thing attached to a pole. I was allowed to carry it in front of a monument to the dead of the First World War. I told the lady in charge that I was hoping to become French, but didn't yet have French nationality. So was there any sense in me carrying the flag? Of course there is, she said. We're celebrating peace, not victory. So it's symbolic for you to do it.
France was sick of war. The wounds left by the First World War had not yet healed. Never again was the general attitude. But in the late 30s, Hitler's warmongering reached fever pitch. France's prime minister tried to appease him.
In 1939, before war broke out, the French Prime Minister, Édouard Daladier, addressed Hitler in a wonderful radio speech. As former foes, he said, "We surely cannot go to war again."
But he could. First, he attacked Poland, and then in May 1940, France. Hitler's troops swept aside all resistance. Stunned, France's military leaders had no answer to the Blitzkrieg. the Wehrmacht seemed invincible. After only 4 weeks of hostilities, German troops marched into Paris. The French government had withdrawn to Bordeaux.
We saw that the Germans were advancing very quickly. The question was, how do we escape?
In the summer of 1940, tens of thousands of French citizens were on the road, heading south as they fled from the invading German armies, for the second time in a generation.
My sister and I had set off south on our bicycles, carrying lots of luggage. We'd covered a few hundred kilometers. I don't have any bad memories of that, because I was 15 and a good cyclist, but it was really tough for her. It was at this time that my sister fell ill, and in the south, in April the following year, she died. She was 19.
After only 6 weeks, Hitler's triumph was complete. From now on, émigré Germans like the Grossers or Georges Arthur Goldschmidt again had to fear for their lives.
Before Hitler made any demands at all, and you won't read about this in any French history book, there was Article 19 of the Armistice Agreement to be observed. France was obliged to deport any fugitive that Germany wanted to have sent back. As a result, many anti-Hitler Germans were interned in camps as hostiles. This was the case in Gurs, for example, and in many camps. All the Germans had to do was pick them up, so to speak, because they had already been detained.
Denn sie waren ja schon in Lagern.
France was partitioned. The northwestern part came under German occupation. In 1942, an area in the east was occupied by the Italians. Alfred Grosser and Georges Arthur Goldschmidt were in the Zone Libre, the supposedly free zone, which was not yet occupied by German troops. It was there in the summer of 1940 that a French satellite state was declared with an extreme right-wing dictatorial government. The capital of this state authority was the spa town of Vichy. Marshal Pétain became the head of government. Jews now began to be discriminated against there too, just as Hitler wanted.
The formation of the Vichy government in 1940 saw the introduction of anti-Semitism at state level. From one day to the next, Jews were no longer permitted to work in the civil service, nor head their own company. Many measures of this kind were decreed by Vichy, by the government itself, and not under pressure from the occupying Germans. There was a kind of competition between the state anti-Semitism of the Vichy government on the one hand and German anti-Semitism on the other.
In the German-occupied part of France, it was now not only immigrants who were in danger, but also French Jews. Systematically, the SS began to register all Jewish inhabitants. Some fled in haste, leaving everything behind and hoping to at least save their lives.
You felt you were in danger, and this fear never, ever left you.
Jews were discriminated against, harangued and subjected to checks. By the French police, too. From 1942, Jews in the German-occupied zone had to wear a yellow star. People like Pascaline Magnat, who back then was called Pascaline Cayenne.
We were supposed to wear the yellow star, but we never actually did. 2 of our little cousins wore it, and they were picked up and deported. We never saw them again. It drove their mother crazy.
Summer 1942. German and French behind-the-scenes masterminds had planned a major coup. All Jews in Paris who were not French citizens were to be arrested and deported. The Grande Rafle, the Big Raid, took place on July the 16th. This is the only photograph documenting the operation. It shows French police vehicles. Jews were brutally arrested in full public view.
Public opinion turned. In other words, there was anti-Semitism in 1940 and 41. People were often indifferent to persecution of the Jews. But in the summer of 1942, when women and children were arrested, they were shocked.
It all took place openly. Thousands were crowded together in the Veldiv, the velodrome in Paris. But some managed to avoid this fate.
There were small gestures. People tried to protect the young ones. If they couldn't save the parents from being taken, then at least they could save the children. Don't go home, they'd say. They're waiting for you. It was little hints like that which prevented someone from being arrested.
In June 1942, during this major operation alone, 13,000 Jews were arrested and deported to the extermination camps in the East. Very few returned. By this time, Pascaline Magnat and her family were no longer in the city. They had fled across the demarcation line into southern France, which had not yet been occupied. Robert Badinter and his mother had also managed to escape. To Haute-Savoie, in southwest France, in the foothills of the Alps, just 70 kilometers from Megève, where Georges Arthur Goldschmidt had found a safe haven. The Badinters led a very discreet life.
For a while, we lodged with an old lady who lived alone and went to Mass every morning, and most definitely on Sundays, of course. She never asked any questions. The policy, the general attitude, was never to talk about things. There was a kind of wall of silence.
A wall of silence fugitives could hide behind. Chambéry, once the seat of the Dukes of Savoy. Robert Badinter attended grammar school here, quite normally, just like all the other pupils.
We lived like everyone else, not hidden away. That would have been a big mistake. And strangely enough, I think, it was this totally natural attitude which protected us. In the final analysis, this seemingly so dangerous policy of leading a normal life as if there was nothing to be concerned about proved to be our protection. You have to realize that the French, apart from a very small minority, didn't like the Boches, as they disparagingly called the Germans. That was because of their memories of the First World War. French families were characterized by very strong anti-German patriotism. The French helped Jews because they wanted to do something against the Germans. It might only have been a minor gesture, but at least it was something.
Robert Badentier's route to school took him over this bridge, which connects Chambéry with Cognac. A short time later, the Badentiers moved into a house in a middle-class district of Cognac.
The mayor, who had been appointed by Vichy, lived almost opposite. In those days, men wore hats, and he used to greet my mother most politely, and she returned the greeting, but he never entered into conversation with her. On no account did he wish to establish a relationship with her, which would require him to ask certain questions. Silence is best. That was the general rule.
But once again, it seemed the fugitives had merely been granted a reprieve. In November 1942, the Germans also occupied Vichy France. And in 1943, after Italy changed sides, they also moved into those areas previously occupied by the Italians. The SS and their French helpers began to search in earnest for Jews, including in Megève, where Georges Arthur Goldschmidt lived.
They often sent me down into the valley to fetch bread and things. Jews were also hiding in the village. One day, I saw Wehrmacht trucks parked outside a grocer's. Their tailgates were down, and this very polite man in a green leather coat, a Gestapo arsehole in case you don't know, was helping these poor people onto the trucks. They were then sent to Auschwitz, and I knew they'd disappear forever. I can still see this one small boy with black eyes. I see him quite clearly. I would love to have said, "Take me, I'm one of them as well." But I didn't, of course. Inside me there was some kind of strange suicidal thought. You're leaving them to their fate, aren't you?
Du lässt die alleine.
Bordeaux on the Atlantic coast has always been a city with a large Jewish community. The aim was to destroy it and all other Jews who had found refuge in Bordeaux. Like Boris Cyrulnik. In hiding with a Christian family, he had been betrayed.
Strangely enough, when they arrested me, I knew that they wanted to kill me, because my family had already been arrested and had disappeared. So I knew they wanted to kill me.
The French police took Boris Cyrulnik to an assembly point, the synagogue in Bordeaux.
There was this woman who gathered the children together and offered them sweet condensed milk. I was scared to go there. There were blankets and cartons of sweet condensed milk, but they were designed to draw the children together. They would all then be locked in a truck and killed. I didn't want to go with that woman and her blanket, so I stepped to one side. That probably saved my life. I made several naive attempts to escape, but they failed. German soldiers kicked me and hit me with their rifle butts. When the order came to leave, I ran towards the toilets, because I thought that, being as small as I was, I would perhaps fit through a window. The Germans never thought of looking up. When things fell quiet, I dropped down again. I went past the French Gestapo. The synagogue was empty. German soldiers were outside, and only the French Gestapo was still inside. They saw me leave, but no one tried to stop me. I just can't understand why.
Since 1941, the occupying German forces had been assisted by French police units known as the Carlingues. There were thousands of them. Together with the Germans, they spread terror amongst the persecuted.
These people, a German and two Frenchmen, came to Saint Raphael, where we lived, in order to arrest us. Someone must have betrayed us, but we had no idea who. Nor did we know how the informer knew who we were, but we got away just in time. My mother went to Cannes, and then I went to Marseille.
Georges Arthur Goldschmidt was also on the run again. One day he fled helter-skelter from the boarding school in Megève because of an impending raid.
I was walking up this steep and narrow mountain path when I saw an officer and two soldiers with machine guns coming towards me. Never until my dying day will I forget that little black hole pointing straight at me. I was in mortal terror. There's just nothing worse than fearing for your very life. Your legs suddenly aren't long enough to make a run for it, and you search for some way of escape. But amazingly, this lieutenant, or whatever he was, stepped to one side to let me through. I was absolutely terrified and sank to my knees. Then I saw this Wehrmacht scout car with two soldiers sitting in it. One of them said, "Such a good-looking blonde lad. He's not from here." I was trembling with fear and headed off into the mountains. Fear affects your self-assurance, and that is the worst thing of all.
Extending from Lake Geneva down to the Mediterranean are the foothills of the Alps, a landscape that is ideal terrain for partisans and fugitives. Situated where the Alps merge with the region known as the Provence is the town of WWII. The name means made by God. In 1943, Pascaline Magnat came here.
My mother was friends with a woman who was living in hiding in WWII. She told my mother that people would take care of us there. That is how we all came to go to WWII.
Roughly half the 3,000 inhabitants of WWII are Catholic, the other half Protestant. The village has a centuries-old tradition of protecting the persecuted. Many Huguenots found refuge here. Now it was Jewish children who were being saved.
I was welcomed by the vicar, Pasteur Monnier. He reminded me of my grandfather. And he said something to me I will never forget. You will stay with us. Here you will be safe. Imagine the impact those words had after all the fear we had experienced. Pasteur Monnier was goodness itself. Waiting patiently outside his door, we queued up to tell him about the nightmares which regularly tormented us. It was reassuring for us to tell him about our bad dreams.
At the time, Françoise Meyer was also a pupil at Beauvaillon boarding school, where Pasteur Monnier taught.
All the children, whether they were Jewish, Protestant or whatever, had to attend Sunday school. It was compulsory. And of course it was Pasteur Monnier who took Sunday school with us.
Today, Beauvaillon Boarding School is a home for children from difficult home backgrounds. In those days, it was a progressive school similar to the rural school movement in Germany. The director was a woman, Marguerite Souberan.
Marguerite Souberan was known as Aunt Marguerite, and her school really was a family, a new family for me. Warm, welcoming and kind. It was something quite extraordinary.
But the idyll was deceptive. Everything could be over from one day to the next.
The Germans weren't far away, only 20 kilometers from WWII, so they posed a threat. My brother and other Jewish children and adolescents attended school during the day and spent the night in a nearby grotto in the forest. If they saw a red blanket on the school balcony, it was a signal to stay where they were and not come in. Occasionally we received information. Sometimes even the police warned us if the Germans were about to carry out office checks, because too many ration cards were disappearing, or because false identity papers had turned up.
The town hall in WWII. The mayor had been appointed by the Vichy government, but Pascaline Magnat had no other choice.
I urgently needed a forged identity card. So one morning, shaking with fear, I went with my mother to the town hall. We were received by the mayor's secretary. She was a charming young girl. "So you need an identity card?" she asked. "Yes," I replied. She then asked what name should appear on it. "Colombe," I said, and told her how old I was. She then looked straight at me and said, "Let's put down that you've got green eyes." She then took a stamp and I left with my identity card. And now to the story of Jeanne Barnier. She was 22 years old and not at all happy at what was being done to Jews.
Jeanne Barnier issued over 1,000 false identity documents and ration cards. A false carte d'identité could save a person's life.
You could get false papers in various towns in southern France. I kept my name because it doesn't sound very Jewish. Things got more difficult when they started using ink stamps. They were harder to get hold of, but it was still possible. Between 1942 and 1944, everyone tried to obtain a false identity card. Forgery had become almost a national sport in our country.
The false ID of Robert Badinter.
Now we all came from Saint-Nazaire, so we had all become Bretons. That was because the registry office archives in Saint-Nazaire had burnt down, so if anyone had wanted to verify our identity, there would have been nothing to verify it with. Thus we had genuine false papers, or if you like, false genuine papers. June
the 6th, 1944. D-Day. the Allied landings in Normandy. Now it was clear that for Nazi Germany, the war was lost. But for the persecuted, at first, the situation became even worse.
Every evening, my brother and I hung a cloth bag containing a little money, some shoes, and false papers in the window, just in case we had to flee. We had an escape route planned, even for nighttime.
France was in revolt. Supplied with weapons by the Allies, now in summer 1944, the resistance rose up. The German reaction was to spread terror. Oradour-sur-Glane. In one of the most heinous war crimes ever committed in France, virtually the entire population was murdered by the SS, and the village razed to the ground. Under the command of SS officer Alois Brunner, special units combed the land, sending thousands to their death.
It was a veritable obsession to pursue Jews right to the bitter end, in keeping with Hitler's wish to see Jews physically exterminated. The concept now was, Germany might be losing the war, but before it is lost, the Jews will still have disappeared from the face of the earth. The aim was as simple as that, to kill every single Jew in Europe.
But where danger grows, sometimes salvation grows too. In the mountains of Megève, Georges Arthur Goldschmidt found refuge on the Allard family farm.
What fantastic people the Allards were. For them, it was the most natural thing in the world to protect anyone who was in danger. They displayed typical Savoyan rebelliousness.
Suddenly there he was, and we knew at once that he was on the run. He stayed with us all the time. He never went into the village, and we weren't allowed to talk about it at school or anywhere else. We were most discreet. I remember it all very clearly.
But even up here, in the remoteness of the French Alps, danger threatened.
Every Tuesday, German soldiers used to turn up on skis. Snow lay on until May. They just wanted to buy butter, or eggs, of course. But every day, the poor farmer thought they would come and arrest him and have him shot. Just imagine how scared the family and I were. I lay hidden in the hay. I thought they'd come and take me with them. I wouldn't wish the fear I felt on my worst enemy.
What I remember most of all is how he used to suck his thumb. That surprised me, because he wasn't a child anymore, but a strapping lad of 16. My father said we should ignore his thumb sucking. I think he did it because he was nervous.
And hidden deep down inside him was a boy's yearning to go home.
I worked out this fantastic attitude, otherwise I wouldn't have made it. If I had felt really homesick, I would either have become ill, or, who knows, in so much confusion, you can so easily end it all, like throwing yourself off a cliff or something. But I found this method of never feeling homesick. And I developed it so well that images of my home village could come into my mind without making me cry.
In those summer days of 1944, Robert Badinter had a knife-edge encounter he will never forget.
I was coming back from school on my bike when I saw German soldiers, military police, holding up a stop sign. They wanted to see my papers, so I pulled out my school identity card. The soldier looked at it, looked at me, and looked back at the card. I didn't like that at all. I looked left and right to see if there was any way I could escape. There wasn't. He called over his colleague and showed him my ID card. I liked that even less and thought, this is going to turn out badly for me. He came back to me and said, just a moment. He took out his wallet. I wondered what he was doing. He then pulled out a picture of his son, a member of the Hitler Youth, and said I bore an astonishing resemblance to him. And I saw this picture of a young lad. He must have been about 16, like me. He was wearing this armband. It almost seemed to me like I was in the Hitler Youth. I smiled. What else could I do? He then put his photo back and looked at me again. And I left. You sense it when someone is looking at you. I got on my bike and cycled about 30 meters. I felt that he was still looking at me, and I knew he was thinking about his son. It was one of the most astonishing moments I have ever experienced. He saw his young son in me, and in him I saw death. It truly was an astonishing moment.
On August the 15th, 1944, American troops and Free French forces also landed near Saint-Raphaël on the Côte d'Azur. Two weeks later, on August the 29th, Marseille was liberated, the biggest city in the region. The nightmare was over. It was the moment Alfred Grosser had also been waiting for. He had lived here for 2 years in hiding as a young teacher in a Catholic seminary.
Ever since childhood, I have been an atheist and at the same time closely linked to the Catholic Church. I was told that it was either baptism and help or no baptism and no help. So I had myself baptized. But I regard that baptism as insignificant. It has no value, and so I don't even acknowledge it. But I was helped by being sent to Marseille, where I stayed until the end of the war.
Victory. Here in Marseille, the war was over in August 1944. No more persecution, no fear, no hiding. The bloodhounds had been defeated, and for Alfred Grosser, a new era began.
A friend of mine was seriously injured in Marseille. He was taken to hospital but died. Lying in the next bed to him was a young German prisoner. Like me, he was 19. I spoke German to him for a long time. He really had no idea of all the horror. and then I felt partly responsible for his future. No collective guilt, but shared responsibility. That became my life after the war.
In those August days of 1944, after 4 years of German occupation, the war was also over in Paris. The Badentiers returned to the French capital. But there was still no trace of Robert's father, who had been deported. Only slowly did the full magnitude of the crime against the Jews become apparent.
Neither I nor my mother had any idea of what had happened. It was only towards the end of the war, in April and May 1945, that we saw American newsreel footage.
Footage like this. At the end of April 1945, American troops liberated Dachau and documented the inconceivable.
We saw the concentration camps. We saw that Dachau had just been liberated. And I said to my brother, Papa will never come back. He was in no physical condition to have survived anything like that. I told my brother that our mother should not be allowed to see such pictures, but she had apparently seen them already and didn't want us to see them. That was when we understood that father would never return. It was all over.
At the end of the war, there were 1,500 refugees living in WWII, 1 in 3 of the population.
My family was very lucky. We were all saved. No one was deported, thanks to Dieu le fit.
Thanks to the help from Jean Barnier, Pasteur Monnier, Marguerite Souberin, and many others, people who simply saw as their duty to help.
We never spoke afterwards about what had happened in WWII during the war. We became friends, and we never had to thank them for their help. They said it was normal, simply normal. That still means so much to me.
The miracle of Dieu le fit was that not one of the persecuted who were hidden was betrayed, denounced, or handed over.
In a village, the whole population has to keep silent. If one person opens their mouth, it's over. A family is arrested. That was also reality in France in those days. There is one statement I heard time and again in interviews with Jewish witnesses. They knew we were Jewish, but they never said a word. That gives you food for thought.
Mais ils n'ont rien dit. À méditer.
Little Boris Cyrulnik survived the war with farmers near Bordeaux, but for a long time nobody really wanted to hear his story.
After the war, whenever I said that I had been arrested by French police, the French didn't want to listen. Cultural denial prompted them to say, no, it was only the Germans. But there were German soldiers and French policemen. It's hard for the French to realize that they collaborated with the Nazis. Many of them find that difficult to accept.
Clearing away the taboos and traumas of German-French history became Alfred Grosser's mission in life.
The work we have done since the war is educational work. It's not work promoting friendship or reconciliation. It's solely educational work about France and Germany. Educational work.
Despite a government and a police force that played an active part in persecuting Jews, in France, 7 out of 8 Jewish children survived. Thanks to people like those in Dieu-le-Fils, Megève and Cognac.
I have enormous respect for them. Every time I travel through Savoy, I always call in at Cognac, and I always feel relaxed and at peace. That's because I am reminded that evil doesn't always have to triumph. There is also goodness in people.
Oui, il y a des gens bien.
I believe that everything I have written has been the attempt to get it all out again. But I can't get it out. Our memory is also there to protect what we have forgotten. And what I have written has always been an endeavor to say the right thing after all. But I'm not capable of it.
Thank you.